Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. At the end of the 19th century, the diet of most Americans was bland and brown. Most Americans had never seen a fresh orange, peeled a banana, tasted an avocado, or even eaten a tomato. Nor had the city of Washington, D.C. sprouted a single cherry tree. This would change dramatically, thanks to the efforts of a new breed of explorers, a small group of men who traveled to distant, exotic, and sometimes dangerous lands with the sole mission of finding new foods and plants that would enrich the American diet 1,000-fold and transform the American landscape. In her new book, Amanda Harris, former editor and reporter for Newsday, chronicles the men whose exploits were every bit as daring as those who surveyed the frontiers of the continent, followed its rivers, and climbed its mountains. Fruits of Eden, David Fairchild and America's Plant Hunters has just been published by the University Press of Florida. Your book is about a group of people and an occupation that most people have never heard about. How did you learn about David Fairchild and his plant hunters, and what made you decide to write a book about them?
Well, I heard about him from my father. There was a family connection there. My father's mother's best friend was Fairchild's wife. And my grandmother and Marion Fairchild had grown up together in Washington, D.C. in the 19th century. And when my father was a little boy, he used to go to his mother's best friend's house. And at that point, Fairchild was bringing back exotic food and stuff. And a lot of adults were very skeptical of some of these things that Fairchild wanted people to eat. But my father and the other little kids in the house, they would eat them all. You know, they would take chances on these weird things like coyote and mangoes and avocados and guava. So my father always told me about this man that he had known when he was a little boy who had had these adventures all over the world. And it turned out that nobody had ever really written a book about his work.
What was the American diet like back in the late 1800s?
Well, for most people who lived in the center of America, who weren't wealthy or lived in on the coast, it was corn and beef and pork, and you could have apples and cherries and stuff, but it was pretty brown. That's why pretty bland and pretty brown. It was whatever people could grow in their farms.
Mm-hmm. But not many vegetables and fruits, the kind we know now?
Not the variety that we know now. I mean, obviously apples have been around forever, and orange juice has been made for a long time here. But people didn't have the ability to grow their own fruits. So everything had to be imported. The interesting, tasty stuff had to be imported. And people didn't do that then. You know, America was such a different country that there was some trade, but it wasn't trade on exotic tropical fruits.
Right. Now, after the Civil War, there were things that the federal government decided that it wanted to start looking to other countries for new foods and for better methods of agriculture. What caused this sudden interest in looking outside the country?
Obviously, there were a lot of factors, but one of the more interesting ones, which I didn't know until I did this research, is that when America started adding territories and turning them into states, and once the United States of America moved west, the nation had land, and they didn't know what to do with it. The northern plains is a terrible place to grow things. It has very extreme weather conditions and bad soil, and so they needed to find. The government decided they needed to find things that grew in other places with comparable weather conditions in other parts of the world and try growing them here.
And there was also some concern that as the population grew, there wouldn't be enough food to feed them.
Yeah, at one point there was a real fear of famine. Wheat was so important to not only to the United States, but as an export for the country, that when they had wheat, that when the harvest was bad, the whole world would be affected. And there really was a fear at one point that there would be a shortage of wheat. It turned out that there was a surplus of wheat, and that caused their own problems eventually. But they did feel like they needed to have more stuff they could grow to keep people from starving.
Why did you focus on David Fairchild? Well, you know, there's the family connection. But he was the center of all of this?
Well, he had a mentor as a young man, and he and his mentor, whose name was Barbara Lathrop, decided that they should do some plant exploration, that what America needed new plants. And at that point, there was no government program at all. So Barbara Lathrop, who was an interesting character, picked up Fairchild, took him under his wing, and took him around the world 3 times to identify good, promising fruits and vegetables and wheats that could come back to America.
And Lathrop was a wealthy guy who just liked to travel, and he took Fairchild. Was he really interested in the foods and the plants, or was he just a rich guy who liked to explore different places?
I think he started out as just a rich guy who had more money than he knew what to do with, and he just traveled, and he circled the globe so many times that he gave up counting. He told people it was 81, but he really had no idea. This was during the golden age of travel.
Right.
So he would take several trunks full of great clothes and go on steamships from one exotic port to the other. And he'd go to the markets and he'd go to restaurants. And so he started the idea. He really was called the patron saint of plant exploration. But then Fairchild convinced the agriculture department that they should sponsor it. It shouldn't be a private endeavor. It should be the government. And so in 1898, they did. They started the Office of Plant Importation. At that point, they called it importation. And he ran it for 20 years. So he was the focus of it. And then he hired the other people and assigned them different countries and different foods to find. And it was this little tiny office in the soon-to-be giant agriculture department that brought in thousands of foods.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about some of the trips that Fairchild and Lathrop went on and how they traveled.
Well, they traveled in full luxury. There was one incident where David Fairchild almost slipped and fell in the Andes, but other than that, he never had any danger at all. They stayed in the best hotels and the best restaurants, and he got to know all the local hotshots, really. These were not local farmers. They were horticulturalists and, impressive scholars. But it did give him a way to see the world in a time when most Americans couldn't do that. You couldn't get into the cannibal islands, for example, and meet a cannibal king who would explain to you
even if you wanted to.
It was hard to do. You had to have a rich guy with a lot of connections to get there. So he had a lot of kind of exotic, romantic adventures. But they turned out to be of some import because he did get ideas and he met people and he had a sense of the world as a large, diverse place that most Americans didn't have at that time. And
Fairchild's father, who had been the head of a agricultural college, and Fairchild had actually studied. He knew something about agriculture.
Right.
He'd studied, and there did seem to be a lot of emphasis on agricultural education at that time, I guess because it's a new country and they're trying to discover how to grow things. And also there was a new Secretary of Agriculture, James Wilson, who sort of promoted this idea of improving American crops.
Yes, Wilson really should get the credit. He's the one who committed the American government to do it in 1898. But at the same time, he was, I think, a stodgy Midwesterner, via Scotland, a Midwesterner, and he wasn't interested in tasty, exotic, romantic fruits. And I think that if Fairchild hadn't wound up with such great family connections, which is that Wilson wouldn't have let him keep going as much as he did, because he wound up marrying Marion Bell, who was Alexander Graham Bell's daughter, and his brother-in-law then was Grosvenor Gilbert. So here he is in Washington, D.C., married to the daughter of one of the most important inventors in American society, who had a salon in Washington and was a very active presence in Washington. and Gilbert was the editor of the National Geographic magazine. So both those men supported Fairchild's work, which gave it a visibility that he wouldn't have had otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of these, the traveling that Fairchild and Lathrop went on was very, South America, Italy, where Fairchild discovered zucchini. In Egypt, he bought seeds for Egyptian cotton, which is fabulous cotton. He found nutmeg plants somewhere. China, Hong Kong, Arabia, the Persian Gulf, where Tokyo, Lathrop promoted bamboo, tried to bring it here. And Fairchild had a thing for mangoes, right?
Yes, he loved mangoes.
Okay.
His favorite fruit was a mangosteen, which is not very well known still, and doesn't have nothing to do with the mango. But it's a really delicious tropical fruit, mostly from Java now, I think, or Thailand. They're grown in Thailand. But mangoes have certainly penetrated the American consciousness, I think.
And a lot of a number of the plant explorers that Fairchild brought into the department were people he had known from agriculture back in Kansas, that people who had studied, young men, who had studied agriculture and also had a hankering to see the world. One was Niels Hansen. Tell me about his travels.
Well, he was the first real plant explorer. He was an old friend of Wilson, Secretary Wilson's. He was known as Plant Explorer #1. He was from South Dakota. And he went off into Siberia to find plants that could grow in the Dakotas, because that was the problem. They had all this land out there, but they didn't have anything that could grow there. So he got himself all the way over there by himself. It was so cold when he was there that he had to wear a double reindeer suit, which is to say, reindeer skins on the inside and on the outside, which were particularly helpful if you ever find yourself in that situation.
I remember that.
Double reindeer suit. And he did. He found alfalfa. He found blue alfalfa and then yellow alfalfa, which is a fodder plant. But it's a very profitable plant, and it still grows. And they actually picked yellow and blue as the school colors in South Dakota to commemorate Niels Hansen's exploration of Siberia. And
you had Mark Carlton, who went to travel to Siberia to buy hard wheat, wheat that could survive Nebraska winters, and he brought back Durham wheat, which became the wheat of. That's the American wheat today.
That's pasta. I mean, that's pasta.
That's
wheat.
pasta. Wheat.
Until Carlton found the hard wheat, people would try to make spaghetti, and they'd try to do things, but they were using soft wheat. And it turns out there are many, many varieties of wheat. And the original wheat that was grown, even in the Midwest, were strains that had been brought over by the Pilgrims from England. And it doesn't have the same growing conditions at all. Mm-hmm. So it was very vulnerable to pests, diseases, bad weather. And so, as I said earlier, for a while there, they were really worried about famine because the wheat that Americans were growing in the center of the country just wasn't sufficient. It wasn't enough. So he came up with a new strain, went over there, found new strains, brought the seeds over, planted them, and pretty quickly transformed the American wheat industry in Kansas and, Idaho, places like that.
Okay. We're going to take a short break, then we'll be back with more from Amanda Harris, author of Fruits of Eden, David Fairchild and America's Plant Hunters. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Amanda Harris, the author of a new book about America's plant hunters. Walter Swingle was one of David Fairchild's good friends from from agricultural college days, and he was assigned the task of solving the mystery of the Capri fig. Tell us about that whole complicated pollination story.
Well, I'll try to keep it not from being too complicated, but Americans had figs. Figs were very popular. They got imported. I think even back then, Americans like sweet stuff. So they like these sort of gooey, sweet figs. And American farmers in California wanted to grow them themselves, but they were never able to get the figs, the right kind of fig, to actually fruit, and become commercially viable. There was a newspaper, the San Francisco Bulletin, even tried to introduce figs themselves, and they gave them away as a circulation gimmick to their readers to introduce these new figs to the United States. But they didn't work. They just wouldn't, they'd flower, but they wouldn't fruit. So there was a rumor that what they needed was a particular wasp to pollinate the Smyrna figs, to take, to have the sterile kind of figs. They needed, the wasp would take, material from the sterile figs and sterilize the Smyrna fig. And it sounded fantastic. People didn't believe it. They thought it was like a superstition, like putting a horseshoe over the door of your barn if you wanted to have a good year. But Swingle was a very smart man, and he went to Italy and he figured it out. And he kept sending back shoeboxes full of figs that had the right little wasps in them.
These are the
tiny
Capri figs, right?
Capri figs filled with blastophaga wasps, which are tiny little wasps, and tried to he packaged them in the, because this was a new thing. There's no way to send things from Italy like this. He'd buy cigarettes, and he'd take the thin paper, the thin silver paper in the cigarettes, and he'd wrap up each fig in this little paper and ship them in shoeboxes to California. And he did this for years. But sometime in the beginning, the figs weren't just at the right stage. The wasps weren't just ready to, be released.
Come out and pollinate.
They weren't ready to do it. But he stuck to this for years. And Fairchild backed him, and they had somebody in California who was willing to plant them. And eventually it worked. Even though there were even skeptics in Italy who didn't believe that they thought it was silly that Americans were spending so much effort to try to make these figs.
But we finally got our sweet figs.
But it happened, and that's why we have it. They're called the Calamera figs.
Okay. Frank Meyer seemed to be one of the most dedicated, fearless, and tragic of the plant hunters.
Oh yes, he was. His story, I think, is the most dramatic story in the book. One of the real reasons I wanted to write the book is I thought everybody ought to know the story of Frank Meyer. He was a Dutch man, a kind of also brilliant but troubled kind of Dutch man, and circuitously wound up working for Fairchild in China. Now this was China before the First World War, and it was a very mysterious place. There were no roads. People didn't speak the same. There were many languages, many currencies, no roads. And Frank Meyer memorized botany encyclopedias. And he was the kind of plant lover who, the first time he saw a plant, he would touch it and smell it, and then he was permanently in his brain. He didn't have to have reference books. He had his own reference book. And
since he had to walk all over China, it's a good thing he didn't have to carry
He didn't carry books. He walked all over China for 13 years, bringing back all kinds of things. But the most famous one is the Meyer lemon, which is a very popular, very delicious lemon that is kind of tastes like it's half orange, half lemon. Nobody knows for sure how it came to be. But of course now it's very popular, and if you're lucky you can buy them in New York. If you live in California you can have some on your porch. But he found this lemon and sent it back. And he told his parents about the time he found the lemon. Just wait, I'll be famous one day. It may take 100 years, but I'll be famous. So now the Meyer lemon is famous, and he's a little more famous than he was before.
Okay. And he also dealt with, not just having to walk all over China and not speaking Chinese, but there were bandits and people who would mug you and maybe even kill you, and the terrible living conditions and the cold, and he suffered depression. It was hard on him.
It was very hard on him. And he had to sleep on. He had to walk everywhere, virtually everywhere. He had a few assistants, but not very many. He had like a donkey that carried 1,000 pounds of baggage everywhere he went. and he was assaulted a couple of times. Foreigners were considered foreign devils. He had to sleep on brick beds that were infested with fleas. And it was too much for him. And I think he died one night. I think he threw himself overboard. He drowned because he was just so depressed by the world as he saw it.
Did he also bring back the soybean?
He brought back a lot of the soybeans. He's one of the first people to bring soybeans back.
Okay. Now the interest in plant breeding led to an interest in human breeding, which led to the eugenics movement. How can we can get a better wheat, we can get a better people. And the eugenics movement flared up for a while. Fairchild was involved in it somewhat, right?
Yeah, he was involved in it. And I think what's interesting, what I found was that the eugenics movement in America had its roots in plant exploration, the plant roots of American eugenics. When they learned about plant breeding, scientists, then a lot of people, some of them innocent and some not innocent at all, I think, decided, well, we could breed better people too, which is to say we could also sterilize the people we don't like and exclude the people we don't like. And it became a very, very dangerous, disturbing little chapter in American history.
And you did have places where lots of people were sterilized, weren't
they? Were in California. And the guy who was the leader of that movement was somebody that Fairchild hired to run a magazine that he had about plant exploration and science and botany. And at some point it became clear that this was a really bad idea. It was dangerous. It was, first of all, it was scientifically unsound, and it was just an excuse for bigots, I think, and racists to sound legitimate. But it did lead, in some ways, to an inspiration to the Nazis, the kind of work that Americans did. And it all started with Fairchild and his push to publicize plant introduction. At
some point, the U.S. government started a movement to bar foreign imports of plants. Now, I noticed whenever you come from abroad on the plane, they ask you, did you go to a farm? Did you bring back any plants with you? Is this an effort to try to keep dangerous pests from coming into the country? And are there And I gather that one of my guests who runs the Anne Frank Center, and they brought back sap cuttings from the tree outside of the Anne Frank house, and they had to be quarantined for 3 years.
3 years. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Now the roots for all of that go back to this. And the parallel to humans is one part of the discussion, but the other one is there are foreign pests and diseases in plants, and if you take a plant out of its natural habitat, where it may have a natural enemy that will protect the nature, and you bring it to America where it doesn't have its natural enemy, it can flourish and get out of control.
Right.
And of course that's happened. That's what happened with American chestnut trees, and there are still people
they were wiped out completely, right?
And there's still people who are trying to bring them back. I mean, they were just heartbroken to see that. And there was one little pest that almost wiped out all the citrus in Southern California about the time.
Was that the fruit fly, the Mediterranean?
San Jose. No, that's still a threat, but the San Jose scale, it's called, came out of China.
Okay.
Anyway, there are legitimate issues about don't bring in too many. You have to have some protection. But I think one of the lessons of the research is that most of this stuff's going to come in anyway. I mean, you can't stop nature. You can't legislate against the wind and the sea, and especially now, there's so much international travel, there's so much interaction among people that it's foolish to try to block all imports because you think there might be some threat to domestic plants.
Sort of like the internet. You can't stop it.
You can't stop these things.
What foods do we have now that we wouldn't have otherwise if you hadn't had the plant hunters?
Well, I don't think we'd have avocados, not to the same extent. We wouldn't have mangoes. We wouldn't have durum wheat. You wouldn't have the macaroni and cheese that you love, we all love. The soybean industry started with some imports that these guys brought back. Turns out there are thousands of varieties of soybeans, and they're all over the place. So
tofu is growing like kudzu.
Kudzu was, well, they didn't. He gets blamed for kudzu, but he didn't really do kudzu. Smyrna figs and mangoes, Meyer lemons. There are actually thousands of them. Mm-hmm. Of course, most of them didn't work. It was all science. They test them out and they wouldn't grow, or they were too expensive to try to make a living out of. But I do think that the palette, the table of America is a far more colorful, tasty spread than it would have been if these guys hadn't gone at some personal sacrifice, found them. And
when did the age of plant exploration end? It really ended with when this small group, this department ended, right?
Well, the department kept going in one form or the other. What happened was, after a while, they decided they weren't going to try to actually bring plants in or seeds. They would just bring genetic material. So they still do that, actually, but it's not romantic anymore. And I'm sure it's very practical. And also, the First World War really put a damper on all kinds of travel and exploration.
Because of the travel.
You couldn't really travel, and and the government wasn't that interested in foreign plants anymore. Mm-hmm. At that point, they had other things that they wanted to devote the energy to. So
it seemed to be that they were. Their contribution. They transformed the country in the same way that that the people who discovered the railroads and the people oil and the car. Yeah. It really was that kind of adventure and that kind of impact.
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, I think so. I think it's a great story because, they did a lot of work and they had adventures. And the great thing is that they, since they worked for the government, they wrote a lot of letters back to their boss in Washington. And they're all saved. One of the great joys of this book was I was able to do research all over the place, and they're just great stories and anecdotes that I don't think anybody really knew about before.
Mm-hmm. Well, they will now if they read your book, The Fruits of Eden. We're out of time. I want to thank Amanda Harris for joining me today. Her new book, Fruits of Eden, David Fairchild and America's Plant Hunters, has just been published by the University Press of Florida. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.